I'm here today to talk about this, the dreaded conversation. The conversation I really hope I can stop having soon. No, not this dreaded conversation. This one. Why aren't we first for head terms? So this can come from your client, from your boss, and normally, like this is frustrating for a few reasons. So by a head term, is this turned off? It's a shame. Cool. Nice. So by a head term, I mean that one keyword that your boss or your client really cares about, and it's normally quite high volume, quite competitive, and this is frustrating for a few reasons, right? Normally, even if you're smashing every other metric, people will still get annoyed about that one keyword. And head terms can be really difficult to predict, really hard to analyze, really hard to explain. And this has been frustrating me for a long time now. Like a lot of people, I started my SEO education on Distilled, which is just a platform where you learn the basics. And I learned about on-page factors, technical SEO, algorithm updates, all the normal stuff. Then over time, at Distilled, I saw more and more problems and sites and more versions of this dreaded conversation. Why don't we rank first for whatever? And I started to feel like I was missing something. I was having so much trouble explaining some of these terms. I started to think, what if actually, at some point along the line, I've just completely missed the point? Or maybe we all have. So in 2017, I started talking about this, and at the time I thought, maybe Google has moved on, and there's something they're using now that has replaced the model that we have, which is heavily based on links and so on. So I was asking at the time, does Google still need links? I've been inspired by this even earlier presentation by Rand Fishkin, where he had been saying, well, look, Google has come a long way since 1998. They have access to a lot more data than they used to back then. Their PageRank, the link signal, that was based on a world where websites looked like this. They were covered in links, and that's how you navigated. That's how you got around. So this was just a proxy for popularity. If Google wants to measure popularity now, they don't need to do what they did in 1998. They're a browser, they're an ISP, they're a dominant search engine. They have tons of data they can use to answer that one simple question. And also, thanks to everyone in this room, including myself, links have become a dirty signal. So Rand's conclusion, way back in 2016, was that we might want to start building links that genuinely drive high-quality traffic. So we're optimizing for that popularity thing that they were going after in the first place. I didn't feel like this went far enough in 2017. I definitely don't now. But my conclusion at the time, I did some research, and basically I was trying to figure out, are links still a good predictor of rankings, or maybe are links only a good predictor of rankings because they're hiding something else? So one of the things I had in my mind was maybe Google could use one of their new pieces of data they have from their platforms now, like branded search volume. Maybe they could use that to replace links as a ranking signal. So this is basically the end of that 2017 presentation and research I did, where I was looking at how much of the variance in rankings can be explained by different metrics. So the green ones at the bottom, these are trying to use branded search volume to predict how well a site will rank. These blue ones, trying to use domain authority to predict how well a site will rank. But the really interesting thing is this model at the top uses both and builds them into one model, and it's not really any better than the one that just uses branded search volume. So I started to think, that's interesting. This is old data now. Some of the more statistically minded among you may have noticed that those R-squareds are very small. They're in the 1% range, so that's more like you'd expect if you were studying economics than if you were studying physics, right? But that kind of makes sense, but it is important, and we're going to come back to that later. If this statistical jargon makes no sense to you, that's fine too. Meanwhile, while I was poo-pooing the continued relevance of links. Stuff was coming across my desk like this at Distilled, where some client works with us, we build them a content piece, they gain a bunch of referring domains, and this is a graph from Stat, and lo and behold, they start getting a bunch more rankings. Okay, so I've not really explained that very well. This doesn't line up with my research at all. In fairness, a lot of this kind of thing was happening at the time with relatively small sites. You'll notice with the color coding, it's not great with this projector, but previously they were only ranking 4 to 10. So they had no strong rankings before they got this hit. And this was the kind of site that we were seeing benefit most. Anyway, so my conclusion at the time, 2017, was, yeah, Google probably still does need links, at least for cases where they don't have better data. But I was still confused and wrong. There are two things I did get right. So I said at the time, competitive data-rich, for the competitive data-rich top-end keywords, that links would mean increasingly little, emphasis on increasingly. I've rerun these studies over time. This is correlation domain authority and rankings, 2017. This is the same just before Moz remade domain authority last year, and you can see a big change. It's gotten better now because domain authority has gotten better. This is another quote I had at the time. So in 2017, February, I said that in 2018, SEO would be about user testing, brand awareness, perception. I don't know about you, but to me that sounds a lot like the expertise, authority, and trust we've been hearing about since Medic last year. I'm still wrong, though. So the reason I'm still wrong is I was still trying to think about this and work it all into this old mental model we have of ranking factors. I was thinking, oh, what if branded search volume is a ranking factor? What if, what if user perception somehow is measured in a ranking factor? The understanding I'm coming to have now is that ranking factors only get you so far, and beyond then, it's not about ranking factors at all. So I've called this at some stages the two-tiered SERP, but a quick caveat. I'm going to use this visualization a few times where I've split this SERP conveniently into the top 5 and beneath. 5 is an arbitrary cutoff. This is obviously going to vary from some keywords to the next. So here's the agenda for the rest of this talk. I'm going to give you some evidence that I think ranking factors at a certain point stop being important. I'm going to explain how and why that might be happening, and then I'm going to tell you how to use that insight to make money. So, what do I mean by ranking factors? Just quickly to explain this old mental model that I'm rubbishing. It's kind of cliche, right? So we all say Google is changing, say it all the time. There was this interview, September 2018, between a CNBC journalist and some Google search engineers. This kind of thing normally never happens, but Donald Trump had said that Google was biased or something like this, so Google decided to show some transparency, invite this journalist to see some actual work going on in their algorithm. So we got an unusual level of insight, albeit very briefly. But anyway, this is a stat from 2017 that was given in this interview. 2017, Google ran about 32,000 experiments, 2,400 search engines. That's 7 algorithm updates per day. And you can see this. This is a graph from, I can't remember who, it might be Dr. Pete or Cyrus, working with Moz. So remember these sort of groundbreaking, earth-shattering algorithm updates from a few years ago, like Panda and Penguin? And how they shook our world? That kind of crap happens every week now, at least. Meanwhile, this is a blog post from one of my colleagues a couple of years ago saying, actually, the fundamental things we do as SEOs have not really changed in a long time. And she's right. This is still true. We're still doing the same stuff, even while this is happening. If I show you a site and say, why is this site outranking me, you'll probably look at basic technical, is it indexed? Does the page render properly in Google? Maybe is it mobile friendly or something like that? You'll look at targeting, is the keyword in the title tag, is the keyword in the H1, is the copy about something relevant? You look at links, quality and quantity thereof, relevance thereof sometimes. And then there are maybe some hygiene factors that change over time. So these days we talk a lot about things like site speed, and these have varied. But we're still just building on this mental model, gradually adding stuff into this old understanding, not really changing our practices. And I still see websites in the wild that haven't really, still doing things that imply they don't really understand reasonable surfer. And that came out when I was 12. So we're still just building on this old model. And I don't think this is just me that has this problem. So we did some experiments at Distilled Search Love conferences a few years ago, where we would ask the audience with a show of hands to predict which of 2 pages ranks better for a keyword. And we would show them some metrics, we would show them the pages in a bit of detail, we'd talk about them for a bit, and then we'd just use a show of hands. And people were really bad at this. Incredibly poor. And we weren't cherry-picking difficult examples, these were just random. We did the same thing with a couple of thousand people on Twitter as a survey. And it turns out that even the most experienced SEOs, worse than a coin flip. You'd be better off hiring a coin flip to optimize your site. It'd be cheaper too. However, no one sucked as hard as me. When we did this show of hands in the conference, I scored 0%. I got none of the pairs in the correct order. And what was worse was I'd actually been in the run-throughs and already seen the answers. So I asked my colleagues for an analogy to explain this situation. My colleague's quite eccentric, but I think this is particularly suitable for a French event. But apparently, if you put a frog in a cold pan of water, it'll be quite happy. Frogs like water. And then you start heating up that pan, the frog will just stay in the water quite happily, quite contentedly, boil to death. It will never notice the fatal paradigm shift as long as it happens slowly and gradually and smoothly. Remember all those algorithm updates? This is us. We've not noticed that everything's just changed completely because it happens slowly. We're asking these questions, which are the wrong questions. Right, I said I've had some evidence, so here we go. I've got 4 pieces. You may remember this study I mentioned earlier where I was looking at the relationship between links and rankings. So I've also been redoing this over time. So at the time I found that branded search volume correlated better with rankings than domain authority, but there was something that was kind of curious, and I mentioned this earlier, the correlation here is 0.07 for domain authority. That's pretty low. But at the time, I was seeing other studies which were finding much stronger correlations. Particularly, I'd seen a Moz study in 2015 that found a correlation between domain authority and rankings that was much stronger than mine. So this is the Moz study in 2015, the relationship they found, and this is mine. So why has Moz found that links predict rankings really well, and I have not, right? So I started thinking, what are the differences between these 2 studies, Moz's and mine? So the Moz one, some random queries they got from Keyword Planner. I emailed Stat, which is a rank tracking solution. I emailed them and said, can I get 5,000 random queries? This shouldn't affect it too much. They're both random groups. Moz used the top 50 results. I used the top 10. Moz is desktop only, because this was 2015. I used desktop and smartphone. Moz is, like I said, May 2015. I've done mine 3 times now. And then the statistical method is the same. So I think the significant differences between these 2 methods are these 2. Number of results used, and when it was done. And at the time, back in 2017, when I saw those results and I was struggling to explain why my correlation was weaker than Moz's, I assumed it was because of this. I assumed that things had changed over time. I now think it's because of this. Remember that thing I was showing you earlier about the 2-tiered SERP, where things matter less the higher you get? I think that could be relevant here. What if links are less important in the top 10? So here's the hypothesis. The higher you rank, the less ranking factors, for example links, matter. Obviously I needed a fairer comparison than some random Moz study from 2015, so I used my own data. So I decided to redo my study, but separating it for the top 5 results and positions 6 to 10. And that's an arbitrary cutoff, but I should still see a pattern. And this is the hypothesis. See a weaker relationship between linking root domains and rankings for positions 1 to 5. Sure enough, here's the 6 to 10 correlation. Here's the 1 to 5. Great. Incidentally, if you care about branded search volume and think that might impact rankings, which I do, similar relationship. Much stronger further down. Okay, so repeated safety warning. I've picked a random cutoff. I don't think it's position 5 for every keyword. It's going to vary a lot. Also, even if this is right, you're still going to need traditional ranking factors to get to the point where they don't matter anymore, right? You have to do both. This is another study that came out. This is redone every year from Stone Temple. Link is a ranking factor study. This is actually a correlation study that just looks at link-based metrics and rankings. And sure enough, they're still finding these relationships in the 0.3 range. But they're using the top 50. Meanwhile, the strongest relationships I can find are for brand, and they're in the 0.1 range. I'm using the top 10. So here's the hypothesis. Higher you rank, the less ranking factors matter. Yeah, I think we've got some good evidence for that. However, some caveats. We can only look at one factor, links, or things to do with links, and a potential factor with brand. We did lack a control, so it could be that something is influencing both rankings and links, and that's responsible for this. That's very difficult to control for, because we don't know what all the ranking factors are. If you want to know more about why ranking factor studies can be difficult to analyze and misleading, this is a great Whiteboard Friday. But for the theory for this presentation, head terms are no longer about ranking factors. Sure, this is a good piece of evidence. This is evidence number 1. Links less relevant in the top 5. Second piece of evidence I've got is about this particular keyword, Mother's Day flowers. This is a really interesting keyword because I said that there would be a difference here between head terms and non-head terms. Head terms are where Google has the most data. So wherever that bit in the top where ranking factors don't matter are, that's going to be big for head terms. Now this is a keyword that becomes a head term for 2 weeks a year. This is a Google Trends graph from the United States, but it's similar in most countries. Now, 2 weeks before Mother's Day, this is 2018 Mother's Day in the UK. Search for Mother's Day flowers. Here's the rankings. I'm going to tell you a little bit about these sites, just so because many of you won't be from the UK, so you won't be familiar. We've 4 high street brands. Your grandma has definitely visited all of these. We've got 4 online-only brands. So your grandma has definitely never heard of any of these. And then you've got one that's kind of in between. They're primarily online, but they're fairly well recognized. There's a chance your grandma received some flowers from these ones. So here's the rankings when we go in. And I think it's important to look at whether they're specialist sites or not, because the specialist sites tend to be more focused and they tend to be better optimized in this space at least. So here's your sites. Here's their domain authorities. Here's their branded search volume. And I think the interesting thing about this is 2 weeks before Mother's Day, particularly if we were only to look at the specialists, they're kind of in the right order, right? Like, for the most part, domain authority goes down as you rank lower, branded search volume goes down as you rank lower. This is roughly what we'd expect. These are okay rankings. Fine, good job, Google. This is SEO as we understand it, great. However, so here we are, 2 weeks before Mother's Day, and we've got these sites ranking that I just showed you. And mostly it's looked like this for the last 10 months at this stage. It's been pretty stable. Maybe just a little bit of to and fro. For example, you see these people moving between 3 and 5, between 7 and 8 here. And it carries on reasonably stably. So it's 2 weeks out now. Fine. Okay. Ooh, what's happened here? Next, SEO team fired. Appleyard, one of these small online sites, suddenly doing quite well. Okay, this is heating up quite a lot now, right? This is definitely different to what we saw before. Oh, this has gone crazy. Oh dear. Oh, sorry guys. Meanwhile, Marks and Spencer, they're suddenly first. They've been third or at best all year, and they're suddenly first. Pay rise to everyone. Big climb from Waitrose. That's another shop that your gran has visited, right? They're doing well. eFlorist. Look at their journey in green. They've been all over the place. Right, and then that's the day before. Hopefully this is the last day anyone tries to buy flowers. If you try to buy flowers on Mother's Day, anyway. So let's break that down. There's a pretty complex picture. Let's try and look at some patterns. So here are the offline brands, the shops that everyone has heard of, everyone has seen, we probably trust. These have generally done pretty well. You know, those are climbing, generally speaking. But in particular, Marks and Spencer's, they managed to get past these two sites that had been jostling for 1 and 2. eFlorist and Serenata. So these are two sites nobody has heard of, but these are the winners if we ask these questions. These are the sites that have the best SEO. These are two smaller sites that you definitely haven't heard of either. The SEO is not as good, but they did okay. I think looking at the smaller sites that did well and the smaller sites that did badly, we can make some comparisons. So here's a small site that did well. Here's a small site that did badly. Now, there's a big difference in first impression here. And particularly, you know, I like trust signals, star ratings, this kind of thing, but you know, this is excessive. There's like 10. I'm trying to buy some flowers. Anyway, and then if we look at, this is another small site that did well. They're one of only 2 that mentioned free delivery. The other one ended up position 1. So winners, 2 offline brands, very trusted, great. Losers, sites with good SEO. Hangers on, bit of a mixed bunch. Okay, so second piece of evidence I want to talk about here first is clearly we have rankings changing when they become high volume. This is not ranking factors changing. None of them suddenly built a load of links, I checked. However, there's something I didn't tell you about all that. Remember those 2 sites that were jostling for position 1 all year and then lost it? They're the same company and they work with me. So I didn't like the story I just told you very much. So coming into Valentine's Day this year, Valentine's Day 2019, I said, okay, can we try something different? Here's your strategy. We're going to do free delivery and we're going to emphasize that, and we're going to go for cheap postable products. Basically, we're going to go for a first impression, both in the SERP and on the page. This, by the way, does not look like an SEO strategy, right? The goal of this is to improve rankings, but this does not look like an SEO strategy. Okay, so bearing in mind that normally these guys lose rankings on their way into Valentine's Day and Mother's Day, which are when flower companies sell all their flowers. This was what happened for Valentine's Day this year. A very different story. However, for Mother's Day, there was some pushback in the business. They decided, no, actually, we're a premium brand. Screw SEO. We only do expensive products, and we only talk about expensive products. So back to the old strategy they'd always had. Back to the old story they'd always had. So again, for our theory, head terms are not about ranking factors anymore. Pricing affects rankings, apparently. That's not a ranking factor. Last piece of evidence I want to talk about is intent. So most of you will know the Medic algorithm update from August 2018. I work with a site in the medical space. They're a very commercial site. They sell cosmetic treatments and cosmetic products. Now, for the keywords that they target and rank for, they did not do well with Medic. But here are the sites that won. We've got 2 magazines, 2 healthcare providers, and 2 sort of health dictionaries. None of these are their competitors. None of these are even slightly commercial sites in these spaces. So my client lost 20% of their traffic. How do you think that impacts their revenue? So here's Medic. Here's their traffic going down, as you can see. There's number of consultations they sell at the top. Oh, it didn't impact their revenue at all, because they lost the traffic that wasn't converting. Now, to explain this, I'll take you back to April this year. Really interesting interview with John Muller at Brighton SEO. And he said something that I found fascinating about how, and I think I kind of knew it already, but I hadn't twigged. You've probably seen it yourself. Google can have blocks in search results for certain types of results. So for example, they might say, this is going to be informational, news, transactional. Or they might say transactional, informational, news, informational, transactional. So in that kind of situation, if you drop one space, you actually go from position 1 to position 5. But if you go from being the highest ranking transactional site at position 1 to being the highest ranking transactional site at position 5, you're still the first result people can click on and buy something. So your revenue might not move, like this. And I think that's a lot of what Medic did. But again, this is really interesting for us when we're talking about relevance of ranking factors, because if Google is reassessing intents on the fly, that has nothing to do with ranking factors, and yet it does affect rankings. Right, so let's try and explain what's going on here, because I'm probably not doing great on time. Why is this happening to us? Why? Controversially, this is an SEO conference, but we're going to try some empathy. So remember that CNBC interview I talked about? So the interviewer was shadowing some engineers who were trialing a change where they were going to put more picture results in searches. And it's really interesting to read about how they were going to measure whether this was a good algorithm change or a bad algorithm change. There are 2 metrics they talked about. First one is what percentage of users clicked through a picture link and then quickly clicked back. So this is, I clicked through, I didn't like it, bad result. I'm going to call that pogo stick rate. It's different to bounce rate. I might talk about why that is later if I have time. Second metric is whether there's a significant increase in the time until they made their first interaction. So basically, I look at the search results, I think, that's not what I expected. That makes the results bad. So Google is measuring that. I'm going to call that time to SERP interaction. Again, neither of these things necessarily influenced by links, but someone's excited. Again, there's been a bit of a controversy with whether Google uses user signals in rankings, right? I think there's a few different ways you could read that controversy. Maybe they're technically correct when they say they don't use it, which is kind of the line that John took here. But something interesting happened recently, about a month ago, maybe. So this top left thing, this is from someone's CV who worked on search at Google. And he's saying, I worked on this thing called Nav Boost, that's the top bullet point. What's called Nav Boost? It's one of Google's strongest ranking signals. If you search for Nav Boost, you find that a lot of Google engineers went to Pinterest, where they introduced something called Pinterest, which uses how well a pin performs in general and in context-specific query based on click, long click, and repin propensity, user data to influence rankings. Now, to be fair, we already said earlier links are a proxy for popularity. Maybe links could be used as a proxy for this stuff too. So this is still not me writing off links. But this definitely does introduce some non-traditional ranking factors. Or maybe not ranking factors at all, like price, aesthetics, lack of pop-ups. All of these could influence those metrics. All of these could influence rankings. So, quickly, what does this mean for your content? Firstly, the fundamentals do still work. This is an amusing example from about a year ago where I was working with an e-commerce company, and they had online in all their title tags. It's a bit like buy toasters online, buy jumpers online. And I said, that's stupid. You're a website. We're doing this in Google search. Clearly everything here is online. Google understands. Remove the word online. Nope, put it back. Google is not as clever as we sometimes give them credit for. Still, we should optimize for their metrics. These are 2 metrics. So how do we optimize for First one, pogo sticking. Remember when Panda came out ages ago, 2012, and everyone said, oh, you need to improve your first impressions, use the Panda survey. Still a good tactic 7 years later. My colleague recently wrote something simple using updated Webmaster Guidelines. Basically, it's about immediately answering the question, not having old and light content, page speed. This is a tool from Google that will tell you the revenue impact of improving your page speed. This second metric, time to SERP interaction. Remember the sites that put free delivery in their title, right? This is relatively basic. PPC is a great way to figure out how you can get people to click faster. Brand, okay, brand can be hard to influence, right? But brand is definitely a way that you'll make people click on your site. But actually, as SEOs, we can do a lot about brand. This is an example from a site I worked with recently. That, like, I'm not responsible for this. They already had this when I arrived. But they're a comparison site in Australia. And they're writing about stuff that will definitely not generate conversions, but they've basically just found places where they can rank, they can get impressions. They're using SEO as advertising. Or you could just, sponsor YouTube channels, do actual advertising, that kind of thing. Depends what you can get buy-in to do. I've also written a post here on how you can measure brand awareness from a small level. Lastly, we talked about intent, right? And Google reshuffling what they put in the SERPs. Best thing you can do here is be ready. This is an example from REI. Caveat, I've never worked with REI, but they're an American hiking store. And for all of their commercial keywords, like hiking boots, they have informational pages waiting in the wings. I think I'm pretty low on time. How are we doing? 2 minutes. Okay, so quickly for PR. So I've said two conflicting things, right? I've said that links still get you in the picture, but at the top they don't make a difference. So how can you leverage that for your actual link building? So firstly, you need to focus on links when you're not in the running, so get yourself into that picture. And then when you are in the running, then you might want to start moving your PR to focus on awareness. Which your PRs have probably been begging you to say for years anyway. When do links matter least? Your page has a different intent to those above it. So that's the example we talked about earlier. So here's another one from that Australian comparison site. Here we've got two providers of money transfer. Here we've got a comparison site. It's quite likely that these guys couldn't get any higher here. Or you're already fluctuating among the top spots. This kind of picture. Now, building links for any of these three sites is probably not what is going to move the needle. What else matters? I mean, this is more general stuff that we've been saying about link building PR for ages, but it still matters. Relevance, brand impressions, traffic. Last quick example for measurement. So I said earlier that when I was talking about pogo stick rate, I didn't want you to measure that using like bounce rate and some other GA metrics because they're different. Quickly talk about why. This is the last morsel of this presentation. So engagement metrics, there's a whole load available, right, that you might try and use to figure out whether people are satisfied by your result. Most of these are crap. I'm going to quickly talk about time on page. So in GA it says amount of time on page is the average amount of time users spent viewing a specified page or screen or set of pages or screens. We don't need to worry about that because it's wrong. This is how GA calculates time on page. Time on page equals page views. Time on page is, the average time on page is total time on page divided by page views minus exits. They do this because they do this weird fudge with the minus exits because when you're on a page, when you load a page, Google Analytics sees one hit, which is you arriving on the page, and then if you stay there for 6 months or 2 seconds, they receive no more data. So they can't tell. So they have to fudge it. So here's some example situations. I arrive at a site, click a social plugin, click to the next page. 20 seconds, we would say, right, that I was on this page for 20 seconds, right, intuitively. And Google Analytics would agree with you. On the other hand, if I do that after 10 seconds and then leave the site, presuming this is an event, they only see 10 seconds. Because something happened, something 10 seconds later, and then that was the last thing they saw. If I just leave after 20 seconds, they say 0, because they didn't see anything else. What's the average time on page? What's the average of these three numbers? Any guesses from the room? I would say the average is 10, but remembering that data earlier, Google Analytics would say the average of those three numbers was 30 seconds. Because we've got 2 exits. So total is 30 divided by 3 minus 2. 30 over 1, 30. Right, so time on page, let's not use that. If you want to have a crack at measuring this kind of thing, I think you have to start down here. These things, like bounce, that could be I arrive at your site, I liked what I saw, it satisfied my intent, I read it for 20 minutes. These things are being a better proxy for going about what I've been talking about today, which is actually providing a good experience for the user. Sorry I raced through that bit at the end. The slides will be uploaded, I believe, but final takeaways. Traditional ranking factors, they're no longer enough at the top. If you can, inherit Google's KPIs. Things we talked about were time to SERP interaction and pogo stick rate, but also, please don't abandon the foundations. They're how you get there. Thank you.